Hello, everybody. My name is Camilla Townsend, and I am here to record the ending that I wrote to a Finish the Story contest that appeared in Asiana in 1984. I should perhaps explain that I was only a teenager at the time, and that although I never did much with the Girl Scouts, I did love the brownies, in which I was very active, and that perhaps explains the childhood decisions that I made as I wrote. The Blue Raindrops of Oz. Trot was bored. Her usual companion, Cap'n Bill, was helping Uncle Henry repair a fence in the royal barnyard, and though she had watched them for a while, she had soon tired of it. She had, in fact, gotten into an argument with Bellina, who was feeling especially cross this morning. We can't really blame her, for what with the gap in the fence and the commotion of its repair, her entire family, which consisted of everyone down to her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, was fluttering about in all directions, and poor Bellina was forced to flutter after them all in a most distracted manner. So Tiny Trot had wandered disconsolately into the royal palace. She was miffed with Betsy Bobbin, who had gone off on a picnic with Hank the Mule without telling her of it, and Dorothy was at a meeting with Ozma and the Wizard concerning the public road system in Oz. Trot sat glumly in an immense window seat, looking out over the glittering Emerald City. For an instant, the dancing sunlight was caught by a ring on her finger, and her gaze shifted to her hand. She had done a bit of traveling in her time, and it had been given to her by the sea fairies when she left their watery domain. I wonder what King Anko and all the others are doing now, Trot mused. Then she thought of her friends on Sky Island. Tiny Trot grinned. Why, I'm a queen, she laughed, queen of Sky Island. I wonder if Rosalie and Gip Gazizzle are ruling the people well in my place, and that old Boolroo, gosh, I'd like to see them again. Suddenly an idea struck her. She jumped up and ran off towards Ozma's chambers. Opening the door, she stuck her head in. Ozma, dear, may I borrow the magic belt for a little while? I'll be back in time for supper. Ozma smiled. I don't see why not. We won't be needing it today. The lovely ruler was so involved in the construction of a bridge across the Winky River that she didn't even think to ask what it was to be used for. Rosalie, the Witch Queen, sat pensively with her hand in her hands in the meantime. The truth was, she was worried. And so when an officer entered and announced, smiling, that she had a visitor, she was glad of the diversion. The officer escorted the caller into the house. Trot, Queen Trot, Rosalie gasped. She jumped up happily and threw her arms around her friend. You're back. Tiny Trot laughed. I can only stay till supper time, so tell me everything, quick. The two chatted happily for nearly an hour, and Trot explained that she had come by the magic belt. Suddenly, she tilted her head curiously and exclaimed, Rosalie, you're not telling me something. The Witch Queen sighed. Trot, when you left Sky Island, with me ruling the Pinkies in your place and Gip Gazizzle ruling the Blueskins, everything was fine. The bad Boolroo was quite conquered. But recently, I've begun to feel something dreadful is going to happen soon. And as far as I can see, the old Boolroo is the only one who would want to cause anything dreadful to happen, though he did reform. Trot nodded her little head wisely. Sounds just like the Gnome King to me, always unreforming. Gnome King? Oh, you wouldn't know about him, but never mind, he's a long story. What were you going to say? Well, my magic can't penetrate the fog barrier that separates the two countries very well, so I'm not sure, but I am worried. Oh, don't worry, said Trot. Even if the old Boolroo does try anything, he's in for surprise. Your magic will protect the pinks and the blues. Across the fog bank in the Blue City, trouble was indeed brewing. The old Boolroo of the Blues was busy resenting the new Boolroo of the Blues, and he had been for many years. In fact, his teeth were all but worn away from the constant grinding that they were subjected to. At first, he had been content to be a reformed citizen living in a cottage with his wife and 6 snub-nosed daughters. But the more the Boolroo thought about the fact that he was no longer a mighty monarch and that a little girl had defeated him, the more he disliked it. The more he disliked it, the angrier he became, and when he became angry, he gnashed his teeth and growled, and even his undesirable daughters dared not disturb him. Now, all this was perfectly harmless as far as it went, but one day something quite serious happened. The former monarch was raging in the attic of his cottage when he stubbed his toe on something, causing him to let out a yowl you should be most grateful you were not there to hear. He tripped and fell. He glared at the trunk which had made him fall and in a fit of fury kicked it open. It was full to the brim with old books, notes, and recipe cards. The Boolooroo would have slammed the lid closed at once, but one title caught his eye: World Magic. Now, he had long felt that without the help of magic, Trot could never have defeated him, and so he was particularly interested in this. He snatched the book up eagerly. It was then that he began to notice the other books. There was an atlas of uncivilized countries, Sky Island and a large country called Oz were included, and even a volume of Sky Island history. The notes were on magical experiments, and the recipe cards gave the formulas and ingredients for various things, most of which aroused no interest in the old Boolooroo. But one large card did attract him. On the top of one side, it said, turning a statue into someone, and on the other, turning someone into a statue. This card caused the former monarch to put on a most terrible grin, and though he usually had no desire to read, he decided these things would be worth reading. Indeed, from that day forth, the former Boolooroo spent most of his waking hours buried in the magical formula of that chest. He learned many useful spells and carefully studied the Encyclopedia of World Magic as well as a Who's Who in the Sky. It was from these last two that he learned all about Oz and Rosalie's powers, which, as we shall see later, were most unfortunate things for him to learn about. If his wife or daughters ever questioned him, he let out piercing yells of rage and boxed their ears, so he was left in peace to make these unfortunate discoveries. One day, the old Blueskin decided to test the spell concerning the statues. He thought of changing his 6 snub-nosed daughters into marble statuettes, but decided that their mother might become overly excited and attract the attention of the neighbors. It was only by chance that his glance happened to land on a small figurine of a brownie, and for a moment his eyes seemed to lose something of their accustomed look of snapping rage. Quickly, he mumble-jumbled some words and put his hand forward towards the statue. Very simply, the statue came to life. A chubby little man, dressed all in brown, no more than 2 feet tall, took a faltering step forward, his bright eyes glancing quizzically about. "Whee!" cried the blue one. "Success!" He gleefully clasped his hands together and began to rub them smugly. "I declare you, Brownie, my slave." With that, he suddenly shot out one of his long arms and slapped the poor little fellow just to make his point perfectly clear. Immediately began the orders to fetch and carry, to find this, to find that, and Brownie, being just born, knew no other way, and so obeyed. The little fellow even found joy sometimes in his fresh new life. With his doing all the chores, the former monarch had much more time to actually study magic, and of course, by and by, he eventually decided he could recapture the Boolooroo ship. In fact, he had extra time to sit and think, and one day his wicked thought sprouted the idea of also conquering the Pinkies. Looking up Rosalie in Who's Who, he was able to form a plan. However, one rather nerve-wracking thought continued to lurk in the back of his mind, and that was the thought of Trot, or any other outside interference for that matter. He had read of Ozma's magic picture and Glinda's book of records, and they could be serious problems. But then a broad smile spread slowly over his features. Since nothing had been done to hinder his plans yet, they obviously had not found him out. There was only one way to avoid the danger of their discovering him in the future. "It seems," he murmured sneeringly, "that I must conquer the world." Now, it must be noted that Brownie heard this last speech, and it greatly puzzled him. Though he never left the attic, he saw other Blueskins from its one window, and they seemed perfectly happy, more so than he was, without being conquered by his master. Thus, he worried a bit about what he and his master were doing. He thought it wasn't right, but he didn't have time to think much about it. Besides, he wasn't quite sure exactly what right and wrong and happy were. He had come to life knowing these words, but he hadn't been able to sort things out yet. Meanwhile, deep furrows lined the old monarch's brow as he sat huddled in thought, planning plans and scheming schemes. At length, he decided on conquering Rosalie first, for she was the only real threat nearby and must be taken by surprise. Then, with her magic added to his, the Blues, the Rain King, Oz. However, problems seemed to have an annoying habit of getting in his way. There was the fog bank, for instance. It was said that a blueskin who passed through it was liable to die before his allotted 600 years were up. When this thought occurred to the former Boolaroo, even his 6 brilliant daughters stopped quarreling for a moment and looked upwards nervously, wondering what the more than usual commotion was all about. Knowing, though, that he was nearly 600 years old and his life would end soon anyway, the ex-Boolaroo decided that it was worth the risk. For when he became king, some wise mathematician would find his age to be, say, 300, and he would make it illegal for monarchs to die, thus solving the problem. At last arrived the fateful day when all was in readiness. First, the blueskin enchanted his feet so that they would carry him wherever his mind wished him to go, making it impossible for him to get lost in the fog bank. He then ordered Brownie to sit still until he came back and informed his wife that he was going out to pick some berries. As he left the cottage, he did not realize that the little brown man was actually trotting briskly behind him, hidden in the shadows of Blue Land, for he was very curious and soon even more worried about his master's intents. The former monarch thought very hard about reaching the other side of the bank once he had gathered enough courage to slip into the dreaded mists. It took him half an hour to do that, and he nearly ran home 3 times, but finally he heard someone coming and in terror jumped into the protected clouds. His feet therefore obediently pointed themselves in the direction of the pink country, and Brownie was easily able to follow the groans that he made in self-pity and fear. When he felt the fog to be thinning, the Boolaroo suddenly halted and began to recite some strange phrases he had memorized, after which he slipped out of the bank. Brownie, quite confused, followed, and at the edge of the bank he peered out and saw, to his surprise, a squat little Pinky just ahead rather than his master. The pink one was scowling at the rich rosy sun and the delicate pink blossoms scattered about, and so in a moment the Brownie understood what had happened. After brushing himself off, the old monarch set off across the half-mile of open land towards the pink city, humming sweetly to himself as he crossed the pink-tinted meadow in his new disguise. Brownie was able to keep him in sight by dashing from bush to bush when the coast was clear, his small size proving a great asset in such a situation. When the Pinky arrived at the city gate, he passed through unnoticed, for he was apparently an ordinary citizen, and he began to wind his way through the lovely pink marble city, walking briskly along the spiral road which he had read wound inward to the Court of Statues, the center of the pink country and site of the Witch Queen's house. Indeed, he soon found the house, as it was situated where the road ended, and to his joy there was no one about at the moment. A sneer spread over his face when he came close enough to hear Rosalie just inside. She was talking to someone. How long he had waited just for this moment, and to think they were so foolish as to believe that someone as clever as he was would reform. Quickly, he mumbled the words he had learned by heart, and at the last moment stepped into the open doorway with his hand outstretched. "Oh, Rosa!" Trot halted in the middle of a word. Her hand froze in midair. Her usually sprightly glance was fixed on the opposite wall. In short, the girl stopped. She was no longer a girl, but an extremely detailed bronze statue. Rosalie, the former witch queen, a flowing marble sculpture, stood as lifeless as her bronze companion. The former Boolaroo and present Pinky had himself stopped short in the doorway, for terror gripped him when his glance suddenly fell on Trot, his brave little conqueror of past times. The motionless state did not last long, however. Within seconds, the realization of his terrific luck swept over him, and then followed his uncontrollable elation. "I've got her too," he cried. "She must have been visiting to plan against me, foolish girl. I'm too clever for them." He stopped. His mouth fell open. Trot was wearing the magic belt. The belt that any world conqueror simply had to have. He had read about it many times, and now, so easily, it had become his. "It's a wonder I never thought of conquering the world before," mused the old monarch. "It's so easy." He snatched the belt from the little girl's waist and fastened it around his own. Taking the garment from her metal body, he began to think. Why hadn't the belt turned to bronze as the rest of her clothes had? And wasn't the magic belt supposed to protect the wearer from harm? The former Bulu's eyes began to gleam. His magic was somehow stronger than the belt's. With that, he dismissed any other questions from his mind. Now, the distinguished Blueskin was not so stupid as he might have been. And so he lost no time in setting himself the task of rummaging through the Witch Queen's home, taking anything useful. Occasionally, he would gnash his teeth together if he couldn't find a certain item he knew of, but eventually he would come across it and then let out a yelp of joy. Finally, everything was in order. He prepared to take his major step. Addressing the magic belt, he commanded that all magical instruments not in his possession be temporarily out of order. There, he cried, I have almost won. Oh, a few will begin to notice that something is wrong, but they won't know that everyone else has the same problem. And no one except Rosalie is close enough to know where the danger is coming from. Before they have had time to get themselves together, I will be upon them with an ever-increasing army behind me. He leapt gleefully into the air and landed with a thump, suddenly remembering something else. He mumbled a few words under his breath and immediately regained his old Blueskin form. Ah, that's better. Let the Pinkies know who conquers them. Besides, no self-respecting Blueskin could do anything in that ridiculous little pink body. Enough preparations. Wasting not a moment more, he rushed out into the streets, shouting at the top of his lungs, behold the Boolaroo, your leader. Ahem. Do any here make any objections to my appointment? Several nearby Pinkies did, and they immediately became marble statues. Others began to flee, and they shared the fate of their former companions. Only two wise little Pinkies in the area had the presence of mind to kneel and agree with him, looking at each other in perplexity and fear. Before long, it was known throughout the entire Pink country that there was a new king, and anyone who did not think so was a fool. Meanwhile, the conqueror was busy lining up an army next to the fog bank, preparing to enchant the soldiers' feet and weapons so that they could safely march through to Blue Land and conquer its people. Now, if we think back a bit in this short history, we recall that Brownie had in fact followed his master, and I think it important to mention here that as the excited old Boolaroo rushed from Rosalie's house, he had not taken much trouble to look around him, and so had not noticed a little brown man step hastily back into a bush. He had actually been cautiously eyeing his master from the open doorway and had seen and heard much of the Blueskin's activity. Rather frightened at what he had witnessed, the tiny brown fellow remained hidden until the blue one was out of sight, and then he darted into the building to see if he could help those poor folks. It made him very sad to see them so still, with never a smile or a word. He wondered whether the magic charm had an opposite effect when muttered before a statue. If he could only repeat the words. He thought he remembered them, but there was one particularly difficult part. Saying the phrase aloud as well as he could, he simplified that hard vowel sound and so confused the spell. How could he have known that the very sound was written on the back of the dreadful recipe card listed as turning a statue into someone? Brownie blinked, and when he opened his eyes, two lively people were looking about with uncertainty plainly showing in their eyes. My belt! Look at this mess! The Brownie jumped forward eagerly. Something very bad has happened, he cried, but now it's good again, and I must tell you all about it. With that, he began to relate all that he had seen and heard, and after further questioning, he also told them what little he knew about himself. Then very quickly, the girls explained themselves and told Brownie what a bad Boolaroo of the Blues his master had been once, and how Trot had conquered him. Brownie was ashamed of ever having helped such a bad man, but the two reassured him. Oh, never you mind, Trot exclaimed. You didn't know then. And now you've probably saved us all. Yes, smiled Rosalie, but what worries me now is what we're going to do about all this. I can only work one magic spell every 3 days, so we must not fail in whatever we attempt, for there wouldn't be another chance. The magic belt will help to protect that hideous creature. Wait. It didn't protect Trot against that spell. He knew it must be a very special charm. That means, too, that the belt wouldn't protect him against that particular charm. Brownie, I know you've tried, but couldn't you say that spell just once? You really don't think you could do it the same way? Oh, dear me. Rosalie, the helpless witch queen, sighed. If only we had that belt, Trot said. The magic picture in the book of records must be out of order, so no one else will know we need help. We can't get down to Earth, and Tiny Trot sighed too. Rosalie pulled her head out of a large box. My ring of invisibility is gone. He's got that too. I wish I could surprise him and take the magic belt before he had time to turn me into a statue. Couldn't you make yourself invisible with a few words and passes and such like? Brownie asked. But then I couldn't work any more charms for 3 days. There must be some other way to sneak up, Trot exclaimed. Yes, I have it. She gathered them close and stated her plan. The conquering Blueskin had just finished arranging the pink army when he noticed a noisy hubbub coming from the direction of the Court of Statues. A bit angry and a bit afraid, he rushed over to settle the matter with, he thought laughingly, a few of his dreaded magic words. On his arrival at the court, he met with a terrible shock. His old enemy, Tiny Trot, was sitting calmly on the shoulder of a statue. She was as much alive as any little girl, quite as brave and cheerful as usual. The old Boolooroo gnashed his teeth. There she sat, alive somehow, defying him, calling on the Pinkies to follow their true queen. Worse yet, some were doing just that. Panic seized him. He froze, but soon collected his wits. Wasting no more time, he hurtled forward, saying something no one could understand. A woman stepped from the crowd and fell in behind him. He didn't see her, for Trot was just ahead. He felt a fluttering at his waist, but paid no attention as he was in the middle of a phrase. He would have done better if he had paid attention, for as it was, he no longer was. Only a semblance of the old Blueskin, carved in marble, remained. All that afternoon, Trot and Rosalie worked at repairing the damage done by the ravaging Blueskin. Their very first act was to return home and inform Brownie of their success, as he had been hiding in case they needed his help again. They commanded the magic belt to fix all those out-of-order magical instruments around the world before any other catastrophes resulted from that drastic step. Then they had to calm the people, explain the situation, and bring life back into all the unfortunate statues, except one particular blue one. After that, they set to work cleaning up Rosalie's modest palace. The Witch Queen had carefully ordered the belt not to affect anything that the Boolooroo had with him when she wished him a statue, so there were many stolen goods to be put away. All of them had pitched in with a ready goodwill, but now they were all three inside resting after having received some prominent Pinkies who wanted to welcome Trot. She was just preparing to go home to Oz, a bit late, it must be confessed, when a great commotion was heard coming from just outside. Rushing to the door, they beheld 4 young ladies and one wizened old man coming toward them. Just behind the new arrivals rested a winged carriage drawn by great storks, and a beautiful magic carpet still fluttered a bit just above the ground. As she recognized them, joy lit Trot's face, and she ran forward to meet them. Oh, hello! Come, Rosalie, come, Brownie, you must meet Glinda and all the others. Hurry, this is Dorothy. She's my best chum, except for Captain Bill and Betsy. But I don't know where they are. And that's the wizard, the famous one who used to be a humbug. He's not anymore, of course, because Glinda fixed him up. That's Glinda right there. She's the good witch of the South. Polychrome, are you here too? I know you've met Rosalie before. And here, she said finally, is Ozma of Oz. And then she stopped out of breath. And immediately the 5 visitors broke into a merry peal of laughter. My dear, Ozma said smilingly, thank you for the lovely welcome, but Rosalie still looks quite perplexed. Then followed introductions and pleasant words in a more orderly manner. Rosalie was indeed pleased to meet the Ozian celebrities and to see her old friend Polychrome again, who had once before come from the sky to visit Sky Island at the time Trot was there last. But Brownie was too shy to say anything. They all trooped into the dwelling of the Witch Queen, except Polychrome, who continually flitted in and out, and Trot excitedly began to relate the thrilling adventures of the day. Glinda laughingly held up her hands. Stop, she cried. We know all. The Great Book of Records is again in use, and really we must congratulate the 3 of you. But surely you are wondering why in the world we are here. Yes, yes, was the answer. So Glinda began to tell of their finding all magical instruments broken that morning. Even the letters in her book of records were all quite blurred. Aha, said Rosalie. The book was out of order, said Trot. Glinda continued. She had been ready to go to Ozma when suddenly everything was back to normal. On the very front page of the book was the story of the day's events on Sky Island. The sorceress flew straight away to the Emerald City and there found Dorothy, Ozma, and the wizard in quite a quandary. She explained, and they all decided to come help put things to rights. Polychrome saw them from afar and came to join them, glad of some excitement without having to go down to the cold, hard earth. But it seems, Glinda finished, that you don't need any help, except perhaps in deciding what best to do with the Boolooroo and rewarding Brownie. Brownie was quite flustered. I don't want a reward, I'm sure. Dorothy smiled. Where did the Boolooroo get all his magic from, anyway? The importance of that question struck everyone at once. Polychrome stopped dancing in and out of the room, and Trot wondered why she hadn't asked. I don't really know much about it or where I came from. It always was the way it was, said Brownie. Ozma patted the little man. I propose we visit the cottage, she said. And so, of course, they did just that. On seeing them appear, the wife and 6 snub-nosed daughters of the former conqueror were quite filled with horror, and they fled screaming into the Blue City. And really, their evacuation made it much easier to search the house. They found the chest immediately. Ozma took some of the volumes to put in the royal library, where the Ozite public could enjoy them, and the good witch looked after the rest. The wizard suddenly looked up. But I'm still wondering about you, little brownie fellow. Why was a round little brown man in the blue country? I think there may be an enchantment of some kind. Glinda looked up too. Yes, perhaps. Let us see. Come, Rosalie, wizard. Together we will try to break the spell. If nothing happens, well, then Brownie is a brownie after all. So the 3 of them sat down together. Before the others were quite aware that the magic workers had even begun, a cloud of smoke suddenly arose and swirled around Brownie. And when it drifted away, there stood no little brown imp, but a young girl. She wore a light flowing gown of mingled blues and grays, and her dark hair floated over her fairy brow. But it was her eyes that they all saw first. They were blue, but it was more than blueness. They were like pools of water as deep as the sea itself. She stood there bewildered when suddenly Polychrome emitted a cry of joy and bounded forward. Saphrice, my cousin! The stranger beamed. The 2 grasped each other happily. Saphrice? Glinda cried. Daughter of the Rain King? How long she has been missing! The blue child turned from Polychrome. I am indeed Saphrice, eldest daughter of the Rain King, but who are you? She smiled. I'm afraid I don't know what to make of things. So Polychrome began to chatter and explain and introduce, and somehow Saphrice managed to discover what had happened. But only Glinda and Polychrome seemed to know her half of the story. So when Polly had finished, she had to explain. I grew up in the Palace of the Clouds, frolicking in and out of the mist with Polychrome. And all my sisters. My father is the Rain King, brother of the rainbow. Well, one day, years and years ago, Lurleen visited my father, and she told him about a beautiful earth realm she said she was going to enchant. She told him she would leave the baby Ozma there to rule later. And she thought maybe that she would want a friend and helper. If there were ever something an earth fairy could not do, perhaps a sky fairy could. Polly and her sisters were too merry to have their spirits dampened with worries, but I seemed to have inherited some of the solemnity of the sea, and so yes, she wanted me to go to Oz, and my father and I thought it best I should go. But in my father's court lived Thorgos, a thunder worker. He held no great position, this Thorgos, but he admired himself very much. He wanted to go to Oz, but my father refused him. In his rage, he kidnapped me and kept me in a small cottage. I think it must have been this very one, and I think he was planning to conquer the world. So that is what became of you, Glinda murmured. How miserable your father was. And my book of records said only that you had been kidnapped. How exasperating that was. You know, he did try to conquer the world, but your father just seized him and turned him into a raindrop. It would be hard to say where he is now. He must have turned you into a little statue, though, before that, to keep you from interfering. What an interesting spell. His magic was from so high in the sky that the Gnome King's belt out of the deepest parts of the earth couldn't protect Trot, but couldn't be changed by the magic either. The two don't seem to affect each other really at all. I understand now, Rosalie said. Saphris looked up at Ozma. I suppose you no longer need me, she murmured. Ozma's clear eyes met the gaze of the little cloud fairy. This morning, in my rooms, there was a meeting, and bridges across the Winky River were not the only things I spoke of. To the west, over the deadly desert, there is a pale kingdom, the kingdom of dreams. One night, long ago, when I was still with Lorleen, I wandered there, and I found the spirits of the night. They danced upon lakes and invited me to join them. They sang to the stars. Sometimes one would slip away alone and wander through shadows around the world, but always to come back. The dawn is their lost freedom. In the morning, they were helpless and still. I remember I wandered through a blue-green wood and found that close at hand, on all sides but that of the desert, were enemies. I fear for the kingdom of dreams. If ever such a one as a Growlywog entered their land, and in the daylight hours one might, he could destroy all. And recently, terrible things happening outside of Oz have made me think if the fragile people could not wander through hidden dreams at night, it might isolate Oz more than any invisible barrier ever could. We would be so very alone. We would have no more friends in the outside world, and that would be sad. The spirits have no queen. Would you go to them, Saphris? Would you dance under full moons and protect them? Saphris was not afraid. She answered, I will go. And she smiled. Wonderful, cried the little Queen of Oz. Now you must all come to the Emerald City for dinner. We will invite all our friends, the Rain King too, of course. We can bring them with the belt. Oh, we must leave the old Boolaroo with Gip Gazizzle to be reformed again. She sighed. He and the Gnome King deserve each other. Trot laughed aloud. I bet the Blue City is all locked up with the snub-nosers bringing news of us terrible conquerors. Then Glinda and the wizard and Rosalie went outside to ready the chariot and the flying carpet for the trip back. And Ozma, Dorothy, Trot, Polychrome, and Saphris were left to themselves. Laughing and whispering, the five of them played a short game of hide-and-go-seek before returning to seriousness and dignity and all the work that had to be done. For though they were a mixture of queens and princesses and fairies, they were all still little girls. The